Well, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Like this. So, as Sandy said, this is a new project for me, so what I'm going to present today is really quite preliminary. I'm opening doors and finding out what's behind them. I hope there aren't too many entrances to Pandora's box. So there's a problem at the centre of 12th century art in Spain, exemplified by the essays in John Williams' 1993 catalogue, The Art of Medieval Spain. For Williams, there is an identifiable drop in artistic production around 1110, and the decline continues until the middle of the 12th century. David Simon notes the capitals from the cloister of Pamplona, usually dated to around 1140, but then moves on to consider the major monuments of the last quarter of the 12th century. Only Peter Klein discusses a significant number of works from the middle of the century in his essay on Catalonia, and it is perhaps no coincidence that the only recent exhibition catalogue to focus on this period is Manuel Castiñeiros' 2008 El Romanico, Catalonia, Toulouse and Pisa, 1120 to 1180, El Mediterraneo. There appears to be a virtual hole in the middle of Spanish Romanesque, and it is expanding as the dating for French monuments gets earlier and earlier. The middle of the 12th century in Spain corresponds roughly to the reign of Alfonso VII, 1126 to 57, who you see here in what is probably a contemporary copy of a charter to San Martín de Valdeiglesias around 1150. Contrary to what might be suggested, the reign of Alfonso VII was not one of poverty or undue turmoil. Instead, his reign fell between two periods of uncertainty. Before, as you see up the left, came the reign of his mother, Queen Urraca, 1109 to 1126, and after, on the right, came the division of Leon and Castile into two separate kingdoms. For the historians of the period, Urraca's reign was marred by tumult and 8 years of civil war between Leon and Castile and Aragon, followed by uneasy peace. The war chests of both participants looked to the church for financial support as tributary payments from Al-Andalus had dried up. Monasteries and cathedrals alike bemoaned this, even when they paid the Queen the occasional compliment. After the death of Alfonso VII in 1157, the division was further exacerbated by the early death of King Sancho III of Castile and by the succession of an extremely young minor who only came of age as Alfonso VIII in 1170. In contrast, the reign of Alfonso VII had the funds to undertake campaigning against the Almoravids, and in the 1140s made ambitious territorial gains in Almería and Baeza, even if they were not permanent. Despite the lack of stability and prosperity in the early decades of the 12th century, there is still a marked preference for setting artistic production in those years, as opposed to the 37-year reign of Alfonso VII. And late Romanesque art in Spain tends to be placed in the decades after 1170. And whether this is problematic depends to some extent on your view of the links between wealth, war, and patronage. And it's certainly one of the issues that I will have to confront in my new project. I may in the end have to conclude that the lacuna is the correct view and concentrate on the reasons for it, but before that I want to see if it is a necessary assumption. And the framework that I've chosen today for that inquiry is nostalgia, despite its reputation as a fuzzy concept amongst historians. The word had not been coined in the Middle Ages, and does not have an authentic Greek origin. It was the Victorians who adopted it to describe a longing for the ideals of a distant past. And there are, of course, many 12th century examples of an interest in the remoter past, from antiquity to the 10th century. And I show you here a Spanish manuscript, example, the 1162 Bible of Leon, based closely on the Bible of 960. But today I want to look at the use of this recent past not the supposed glories of Visigothic Spain, the Asturian kingdom, or, as here, the 10th century, but in generational terms, something closer to the grandparent-grandchild relationship, and so not so very different in terms of years from the current renewed interest in brutalism. More specifically, the impetus for this talk was a chronicle, the Chronica Alfonsi Imperatoris. The author, probably Bishop Arnaldo of Astorga, shows no interest in the distant deeds of the Visigothic kings. His declared purpose is to describe the gesture of the Emperor Alfonso VII, just as he has learned and heard of them, as he says, all of which are recounted in a spirit of crusading. In one passage, he describes the events around Alfonso VII's reoccupation of Castilian Castro Jerez in 1131, previously taken by the King of Aragon. It says, there was great happiness throughout his kingdom, such as there had not been up to the time since the death of his grandfather, King Alfonso. And after Alfonso VII was proclaimed emperor, 1135, the chronicle says the emperor bestowed customs and laws upon all his kingdom, just as they had been in the time of his grandfather Alfonso. Talks of restitution of church property, plundered land to be repopulated, the planting of vines and trees, and the establishment of law and order. Now, his grandfather was King Alfonso VI, who ruled from 1065 to 1109, and oversaw major ecclesiastical change, including that from the old Hispanic liturgy to the Roman liturgy. Most dramatically, he added the vast territory of Toledo to his kingdom in 1085. So was this statement in the Chronicle just a passing comment, a trope of a golden age and its restoration, an Augustan reference to go with the imperial title? It is, of course, a trope, yet I would argue it is also highly specific in its reference to the reign of Alfonso VI. But is it possible to find other cases of nostalgia, or at least a hankering for the reign of Alfonso VI? The first body of evidence I'd like to present comes from two cartularies, the Tumbo A from Santiago de Compostela and the Liber Testamentorum from Oviedo. Despite certain differences, I feel that these manuscripts were produced with a keen awareness of activity in the rival city. The ultimate aim of each project was, of course, to glorify and promote, in one case the Archbishop of Santiago, and the other the exempt bishopric of Oviedo. Both presented themselves as important destinations for pilgrims. Tumbo A is a luxury manuscript that records royal and other gifts to the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. It has a prologue, although the text seems to have been added after the main part of the manuscript was already complete, and it reads like a colophon. Presents the enterprise as primarily archival, a modest statement that is belied by the quality of the parchment, the script, and the illumination. It includes a date for the start of the project, 1129, which it attributes to Bernard, the treasurer of the cathedral, who died in 1134, giving a probable, if not absolute, terminus antiquem for Tumbo A. The contents of this cartulary were much studied in the 20th century by Morelenko, Diaz and Yaza, as well as more recently by Rocío Sánchez Enjeras and Rosa Rodriguez Porto. The manuscript opens with the folios you see here. On the left, a charter of the 9th century King Alfonso II, which aside from its donation of land, records how that king, on hearing of the discovery of the body of St. James, had hurried to Santiago. And you can see the miniature depicting the finding of the tomb at the base of the right-hand column of text. Alfonso II and Alfonso III can both be seen here against blue backgrounds and in formal poses. There are also several differences, the thrones, which hand holds the scepter, etc. If we move forward to the miniature of Alfonso VI, although illuminated in a different style by a second artist, we can see that this image nonetheless preserves the format of the book. King Alfonso VI is shown in a golden frame against a blue panel, like the other Alfonsos, but he is accorded a distinctive extension to his titulus, Adephonsus Rex Pater Patria, an addition that could be said to be nostalgic. King, father of the fatherland. Setting aside the miniatures of royal women for the moment, including that of Queen Urraca, I wish to highlight a comparison between this depiction of Alfonso VI and that of his grandson, Alfonso VII. The young king occupies a similar throne and is set against a blue background, albeit under a micro-architectural arch, not in a rectangular frame. Each holds a scroll, but in a different hand. They sit on similar cushions and wear a cloak of similar design. For all the minor variations, this young figure is, I think, clearly depicted as his grandfather's successor. And although this manuscript is clearly a political tool, I suggest that it may be working with the predilections of the new king and of the cathedral, of course, to accomplish its aim. The cartulary from Oviedo, the remarkable Liber Testamentorum, you see here, right, has a set of highly crafted illuminations alongside its collection of privileged testamenta from Asturian rulers, represented by 7 full-page miniatures. As the last charter listed is dated 1118, the manuscript is usually dated to around 1120, and is attributed to Bishop Pelayo, who held the see from 1101 to 1130, an attribution that relies partly on a May Fekid entry, although that's also slightly suspect. To complicate matters further, Pelayo returned to administer the see in 1142 to 43 and did not die until 1153, until which time he seems to have remained in Oviedo and occasionally still used the title bishop. Although the accepted dates see this manuscript as 10 years or more in advance of Tombo A, and the Liber Testamentorum is copied in a remarkable archaic script, it seems to me that both books are locked in an archival and artistic argument in pursuit of their rivalry, and thus may have been produced quite close together, which is why I put this comparison here between the Liber Testamentorum and the Privilegium, you see on the left, which is circa 1150. The Liber Testamentorum differs from Tombo A because it is written on low-grade vellum, employs lead point as well as dry point for ruling, which is otherwise unknown in Spain until actually around 1180, but it can be found occasionally in France. Like Tombo A, it includes a high number of depictions of royal women, a phenomenon recently highlighted by Lucid Click. When the manuscript was intact, it had a miniature of Alfonso VI and one of Queen Urraca, although none for Alfonso VII, as Pelayo had bad relations with the king, who deposed him in 1130. I want to focus on the image of Alfonso II because Pelayo partly allies the persona of this Asturian Alfonso with Alfonso VI. As Peter Linehan has said, Pelayo was the prince of falsifiers. The extent of the forgery in his works renders them at best difficult for historians. So perhaps we should not be surprised if we find fictions embedded in the visual aspects of his books. And this image credits Alfonso II with the donation of the Arca Santa to Oviedo, the cathedral's most important collection of relics, supposedly from the Holy Land. But the housing that is depicted in the miniature is the gilt silver Arca Santa, as presented by Alfonso VI after he reclaimed a tithe for tribute payments from Granada and Seville in 1074. The same source of funds had enabled the foundation of the new cathedral in Santiago de Compostela. Pelayo's other writings confirm that he was a great admirer of Alfonso VI. Amongst his collected works is a short chronicle of the kings of Leon, which ends in a lament for the death of Alfonso VI. And having celebrated his wars against the Saracens, his settlement of conquered territory, Pelayo proclaims him father and defender of all the Spanish churches. A phrase that might be more extravagant in its rhetoric than Tombo A, but carries a similar message. But is it possible to to extricate any sense of nostalgia from this political posturing. I now want to turn away from churchmen's use of the royal recent past and concentrate on their treatment of the ecclesiastical recent past. And to do this, I'm going to use a sacred topography, part of my overall aim in the project, to focus on roots and networks. So this is a topography of around 1100 churchmen who lived around 1100 in Spain, exemplar perhaps, who were acknowledged as saints and had the requisite vita, the account of their life and miracles, to justify that accolade. In each case, these texts have been preserved in different versions over the centuries, recrafted and elaborated, often with significant interventions from the 13th to the 17th centuries. As you can see from the map, the cults are quite disparate and rarely on the pilgrimage road to Santiago. And I'll briefly summarise each of these cults. There's 6 examples, and they come in 3 pairs. The first 4, indeed, are bishop saints, and Eduardo Carrero has written about 9th and 10th century bishop saints, whose cults continued into the 12th century in Galicia and Leon. But the saints that are relevant here lived in the late 11th or early 12th centuries and became saints very soon after their deaths. The first pair came to Spain with Bernard of Cederac, a Cluniac who was appointed Archbishop of Toledo in 1086. And according to the early 13th century historian Jimenez de Vara, Bernard chose upright and educated men from diverse places who were also young and quick to learn. The first in his list is San Geraldo, or Gerald, who came from Mossack. In Spain, he was first a cantor in the church of Toledo, and then promoted to be Archbishop of Braga in the west. He died in 1108, roughly, and the first version of his vita was written by Bernard, later Bishop of Coimbra. Gerald's medieval cult is not particularly visible, as the chapel dedicated to him in the cathedral was completely refurbished in later centuries. His legacy is thus, perhaps appropriately, primarily oral, and the Aquitanian chants that he introduced as part of the new liturgy. The second young man on Vera's list, Peter from Bourges, was an administrator, first archdeacon in Toledo, and then Bishop of Osma on the River Duero. He died in 1109, around the time of the death of Alfonso VI, and indeed he had just attended the deathbed of the king. His vita was probably written by Canon of Osma, perhaps not until 1168. As with Geraldo, we've lost the original tomb of Peter of Osma, but he was given this rather splendid new tomb, probably in the 13th century, with sculpted scenes from his vita. If we look for earlier material evidence of the cult, now more of the textile has been associated with his burial, now as we see in Boston, but there is no fixed association with the cult, we just can't be sure. The second pair of saints come from the Pyrenees, and although these sites are some miles away from Leon and Castile, the cultural distance was not necessarily so great. Alfonso VII was married to Berengar of Barcelona for most of his reign, and many Catalan churchmen travelled or settled further west. Ot, or Odo, was the son of the local Count of Payas of Vera, and he served as Bishop of Roger till his death in 1122. His reforming credentials are perhaps best expressed through the intercessory paintings in the small rural churches favoured by his family. And here I show you San Pedro Gallo with a funerary image of his mother. Ot was promoted as a saint by his successor as Bishop of Roger, Père Berenguer, and canonized locally in 1133. Embroidered textiles, again associated with his cult, perhaps here a little more certainly here, and this includes a banner thought to have hung over his altar in the cathedral. His contemporary and rival, territory anyway, Raimundus or Ramon, was born on the north side of the Pyrenees, probably near Saint Antoine de Frégelas in Pamiers, where he was first a regular canon. Ramon was appointed Bishop of Roda de Savona in 1104. His contribution to reform seems to have centered on the library and a reputation for scholarship established at Roda, especially in the field of canon law. He honoured previous saintly bishops of Roda and promoted devotion to St. Antoninus and to the Virgin. This document records consecration of an altar to the Virgin in 1122. Ramon died shortly afterwards, in 1126, after returning from campaign with Alfonso I of Aragon, and his cult was developed from 1136 by a successor, Bishop Galfred, who seems to have commissioned a vita, which contains very little narrative, translated his body in a wooden coffin from Huesca, where he had died, and added him to the dedication of the church. On the 27th of December 1170, his body was translated into a new tomb at a ceremony led by the Bishop of Lleida and King Ramiro II, and this is thought to be that tomb. It contains only one depiction of the saint between two deacons on one of the short signs. You can see that here. Otherwise, it is carved somewhat oddly with an infancy cycle and lacks the weepers that were already present, for example, on Queen Blanca's tomb in Nájera shortly after 1156. The infancy iconography is not an obvious choice since Ramon's feast was celebrated on the 21st of June. But it does, I suppose, work the date of the translation, the 27th of December, or perhaps it relates to his devotion to the Virgin. Aside from bishops, some other churchmen became the object of cults, including my final pair of saints, both called Domingo. The first is one of the very few whole bodies recommended in Spain by the author of the Pilgrim's Guide in the Codex Calixtinus, the confessor Santo Domingo de la Calzada, said to have died in 1109 again. So St. Dominic of the Paved Road, in the eponymous town in La Rioja. However, his cult cannot be traced before the 1130s, and for the first surviving vita we have to wait to 1288. The references to Domingo in the 1130s occur in charters of Alfonso VII, where he is confirming decisions of his grandfather Alfonso VI. At this stage, the saint is linked to a double monastery of Santa Maria by the river Oca, and to a confraternity, confratrium, of the same place. And the lack of any early narrative, together with this group identity, suggests perhaps that this cult may be a confection, almost the canonization of the road itself. In 1134, there's a reference to a tomb by the river Oca, but the tomb now, in the south transept, as you see here, the church is about 1223, and it's said that the first stone of this collegiate church was not laid until 1158. So like Osma, the church at La Calzada has late Romanesque sculpture, not clearly linked to this cult. Here it decorates the ambulatory, where actually Francesca Espanyol thinks the tomb was, although Rocío Sanchez disagrees with her. And most remarkably, it decorates the piers of the ambulatory. The application of this kind of Romanesque sculpture to atypical surfaces, capital friezes as well as piers, is characteristic of the Spanish response to the development of Gothic at this period. My last example in this section, perhaps not surprisingly, is the other Domingo, the eponymous abbot of Santo Domingo de Silos, although he died in 1073, in the early years of Reform. He's represented as a modernizer, and his 12th century cult develops with speed and clarity. We've already had an office for him before 1100 in the Antiphonea of Silos, where several texts and chants are based on Vita. And the translation of the body from the cloister to the church in 1076 recorded on the cloister capital, you see here, is well known. And the sculpted hybrid beasts perhaps recall rich textiles that enveloped that body. This cult, of course, flourished in the ambit of one of the most sculptured and controversial cloisters in Spanish Romanesque, to which I shall return. Objects also perpetuated this cult, including this ivory box carved in the Taifa kingdom of Toledo in the early 11th century, but repaired, or we could say reused, in the second half of the 12th century by the addition of an enamel depicting Santo Domingo between two angels. Well, this brief survey has, I hope, confirmed at least a desire amongst certain churchmen to preserve and celebrate aspects of the extensive changes introduced in the late 11th century. New music, new ecclesiastical institutions, new pilgrimage routes, new canon law texts. But the material expression of these cults is, I admit, highly variable and often too reinvented in later centuries for us to be able to access any earlier form, if indeed there was one. And it is perhaps also worth noting that these are very minor people, really. There don't seem to be attempts, or at least not successful attempts, to canonize people like Diego Jimenez. And actually that's a slightly strange thought, when you think of it. The second part of my paper, which also comes in two sections, will consider material expression in the form of Romanesque sculpture, again using the idea of nostalgia as a catalyst. In The Art of Medieval Spain, David Simon said that from the middle of the 12th century in Spain, it was notable for its constancy in adhering to a Romanesque aesthetic, and that word constancy was surely carefully chosen to evoke almost a sense of loyalty to the aesthetic that had developed in tandem with so many other changes in the peninsula. So in this first section, I'm going to look at some examples of retention through reuse and redisplay. Before I turn to northern Spain, I'd just like to note the Almoravid use of spolia from Cordoba in Morocco in the middle of the 12th century, studied by Mariam Rosa Owen, and also that after the fall of that caliphate, Andalusi texts certainly captured the sense of melancholy around lost glories, so often associated with nostalgia. But can we find any reflection of that literary genre in the art of the North? Well, I recently argued that the tympanum at San Isidoro at Leon, the Puerta del Cordero, was reset and composed from reused pieces of sculpture. And this argument was partly based on observations by Zerlander. The sculpture was probably carved around 1100, and the resetting probably took place after 1147. The typological iconography, where the sacrifice of Abraham prefigured the sacrifice of Christ, here in the form of the Lamb of God, with its Eucharistic symbolism, was more appropriate for the regular canons who had displaced the nuns of the previous double monastery. The overtones of Reconquista, suggested by the location of the victorious lamb above the sacrifice of Abraham frieze, which contains figures of Hagar and Ishmael, led John Williams to date this doorway originally to 1147. Now, none of this is to question Maria de los Angeles Utrero and Jose Ignacio Murillo's 2017 reading of the archaeology of the building. But sculpture is not necessarily an immovable part of structure, and I thought I would show you my favourite drawing of the moment by George E. Street of what he called in 1863 the blank tympanum of the Puerta del Perdón, the south transept doorway at San Isidoro. So obviously not blank now. No, I don't have a reason for this yet, maybe never. Above the tympanum of the Puerta del Cordero, a rearrangement of other pieces of sculpture carved in mostly coherent style displays the skillful work of around 1100, but preserves only a partial sense of the original scheme. Amanda Dotsev argued in her 2015 PhD that some of the relief sculpture was reused on the north doorway at San Quirce de Burgos, and that it was originally set on the west doorway and should be dated to around 1130. Alternatively, the sculpture has been dated to around 1147 by Daniel Rico Campos. The date of 1147 refers to the consecration of San Quirce as a collegiate church. Dotzet's argument is based on close physical analysis, and it is, of course, for her to present it. From my point of view, regardless of whether the slabs are reused from circa 1130 or carved ex novo in the middle of the 12th century in a style that is plausible for 1130, they are useful for my purpose. What is notable is the decision to display them so emphatically within these thick rectangular frames. Now, the most obvious example of sculpture redisplayed is, of course, the Puerta de las Platerías at Santiago de Compostela. If it were not for the description in the Codex Calixtinus, we should surely have dismissed this collection of pieces as an improbable hotchpotch, entirely confected at a much later date. As has been noted by Manuel Castiñeiras, the doorway has been through a number of revisions, around 1200, in the 15th century, in the 18th and 19th centuries. And these account, for example, for the sculpted windows about the doorway around 1200, and for the addition of sculpture moved from the north doorway, the Porta Francigena, around 1157. Later interventions do not, of course, account for all the oddities of this doorway. There continues to be a tension between the putative decoration of the original doorway, perhaps 1110, and the sculpture described in Chapter 9 of the Pilgrim's Guide, I think around 1150. Manuel Castiñeiras' 2018 version of the first schema sees a row of apostles either side of a Christ in majesty and below two tympana, not that unlike what we have now, which is not obviously at variance with the description in the Pilgrim's Guide. For my part, I struggle to accept the collection of slabs and fragments in the tympana as intended for that purpose, even once the incongruous fillers are removed and any possible resizing of the door opens is taken into account. And as often been remarked, some of the pieces are clearly cut down, and I show you here the woman with the skull from the left tympanum and the arrest of Christ from the right tympanum. It has been suggested that the woman came originally from the north doorway, which featured relief sculpture of Adam and Eve and of the Incarnation. And when I see that Eric Fernley is going to talk about this figure at the forthcoming conference in York or David Park. But what I want to talk about today is not that, but the temptations in the left tympanum also. It is clear from the Codex Calixtinus that these flat reliefs were mounted on the Puerta de las Platerías by the time the Pilgrim's Guide was written, which has to be between 1137 and 1173, and is probably around 1150, as I concur with the recent dating by Rosa Rodriguez. Even so, what we have before us does not fit exactly with the description, as, for example, the hideous angels are not placing Christ on the pinnacle of the temple. It seems rather emphatically not on the pinnacle. The temptation of Christ is not a frequent choice for portal sculpture, or elsewhere for that matter. When it does occur, there are two forms: an extended version matching the biblical narrative with 3 encounters between Christ and the devils, or an abbreviated narrative, often with only 2 figures. A celebrated extended sculptural example is found at Saint-Pierre, Beaulieu, recently reinterpreted by Michele Vescovi, who works with a more established date bracket of 1130 to 40. Barbara Franze, in contrast, has argued for a circa 1119 date, which fits with her other early dating. Although the style of the Santiago sculpture clearly resonates with sculpture from Conques and not from Beaulieu, the surviving pieces at Santiago would fit better in a porch or another wider horizontal arrangement. The current arrangement at Santiago is also theologically problematic, because Christ is meant to confront the devils as he does at Bouillon. The role of the angels is not to intervene, as implied here, as if Christ needs help, but to minister to Christ after the devil's departure, when the conflict is over. Generally, the sculpture on the doorway is dated before the fire of 1117, which is regarded as one reason for the fragmentary nature of the current arrangement. Yet I don't think we should rule out a later date for some of the pieces, including the temptation sculptures, and I realise that that doesn't fit with the early dating now assigned to the Temple at Comte. The description in the Codex Calixtinus, however, works against my questioning of the coherence of the Puertoneras Platanias, because there is no sense of any stylistic or iconographic inconsistency in the author's view of the portals. To judge from the words of that author, he is able to draw interpretation from the sculptures unimpeded by any sense of their fragmentary state. In short, his approach is fundamentally literary. He describes each doorway in the same tone, the north, the south, and the west, even though the Porta Francigena, the north doorway, seems to have been much more complete and coherent than the others, and reserves the greatest praise for the west portal, which may never have been finished. Detailed descriptions of the buildings or sculpture in the Middle Ages are so rare that when they do occur, they are naturally treasured by art historians, especially when the Pilgrim Guide shows signs of surprising accuracy. But entirely dependable descriptions should perhaps not be expected of the Pilgrim's Guide author when his work is compared to, say, the almost contemporary Meraviglia or Visceroma. All that is sure, I think, is that the Pilgrim's Guide states its admiration for the first mason of the Basilica, Bernard the Elder, marvellous master, and the others who worked there in the reign of King Alfonso VI, as well as using phrases such as beautifully or admirably sculpted. At Santiago and at Leon, we therefore have evidence, at least of preservation and appreciation of works from the recent past. Now, this last section on reinvention is perhaps the most difficult, and I'm going to keep it brief, so I will not be running through all the sculpture that might be assigned to the middle of the 12th century. Instead, I'm going to give you 4 examples, all depicting apostles, and thus perhaps exemplifying the idea of the vita apostolica for the monks or canons who commissioned and viewed them. If turning certain pioneering reformers into saints was one way of consolidating the past, invoking the vita apostolica was a method that could work more widely, especially in an environment where hagiographers were embracing the 70 or 72 evangelizing apostles mentioned in the Gospel of St. Luke. I should just say that the monuments that I'm not going to be talking about, mentioned in the 2008 catalogue, include Pamplona un Castillo, which was in the conference at Poitiers, Blanca's tomb at Nájera, Sangüesa, Oña, Cardenio, and Santa Maria at Carrion de los Condes, for those of you who know this material. But the ones that I'm going to talk about. So each of these is carved in a Romanesque style, which is rendered archaic in one way or another. The most established example is a set of statue columns, probably once altar supports. At least that's what Moralejo thought. Again, they come from Santiago de Compostela, but from San Pelayo or Payo de Altales, the first protectors of the body of St. James, not the cathedral. Each column has 3 apostles, and here are examples from the columns still in Spain. One column has Peter, Andrew and Paul, another Bartholomew, Matthew and James. One column is in Harvard, and the fourth is lost. They're usually dated to around 1152, because that's the year of a renewed concordia between the monks of San Baio and the cathedral. Now, although they adopt the column figure form, the figures are carved in a Romanesque style that Moralejo saw as deriving from the early years of Romanesque, from Spain's relationship with Toulouse, especially the fine delineation of the drapery folds and the highly decorated borders, though the deeply drilled eyes are perhaps their most arresting feature. The decision to employ an archaic approach for depiction of these apostles may of course have been determined to some extent by the subject matter and the political position of Anti-Antares. Its power lay vast. And I thought I would bring this together with a couple of other examples. A less adventurous and more hieratic group here, executive of the cathedral, probably once decorated the facade around 1150. Although different in size and function, these apostles share several features with the Santiago column figures, including their approach to differentiation. Each one carries a book bearing his name, as well as an individualized style of hair and beard. And here the drilled eyes are filled with lead. Another traditional version of this theme comes in the form of a capital from the monastery of San Benito at Sahagún, also thought to be after 1150. These 8 apostles sit under an abacus that forms an arcade, and again the forms of the hair and beards are used to individualize. As the first centre of liturgical reform in Spain, Sahagún was the cradle of the acceptable recent past. Now, this is, of course, is my last example, because after this, where could one go? And I obviously can't do any justice to this in a paragraph or so. This is, of course, Santo Domingo de Silos, and in particular the large narrative panels that decorate the corners of its controversial cloister. 4 of these narratives include groups of apostles, as you see here, very much arranged in rows. The Ascension on the left, and on the right, the doubting of Thomas. The historiography could fill several BAA lectures, so for the moment I really only want to raise questions. These panels are dated around 1100 by Elizabeth Valdez del Alamo in her major monograph. Elizabeth worked on this building for much of her life and sees the details very clearly. But Dorothy O'Connor, for example, dates it to the 3rd decade of the 12th century, to 1120 to 30. And I suppose I just want to ask, could they be even a little later? Yes, the rows where the apostles are archaic. But their approach to differentiation is not very different from my other examples, and you'll see this more clearly here in the Road to the Emmaus panel. And the use of deep undercutting for the clouds, shall we get back to that, also might suggest that this is not completely incompatible with a post-1130 date in a nostalgic community. So what can I conclude at this very early stage in my project? Well, first I think there is an identifiable sense of nostalgia for the period of prosperity and pioneering reform in the time of Alfonso VI, although I would not claim that it was a dominant mindset. I think it's much more appropriate to see it in particular places at particular times. And it would be an understandable way of thinking in a kingdom that was still undergoing rapid change and had been through amazing turmoil in that sense since the late 11th century. Second, it was expressed, I think, this sense of nostalgia in historical writing and occasionally through the development of saints' cults, which seems to me to mean that it was stronger in certain ecclesiastical sectors. And thirdly, any aesthetic expression is harder to pin down. Perhaps it can be seen in a wish to preserve earlier sculpture and occasionally in a decision to carve in styles that look back to the earlier period of Romanesque. And lastly, that I need to do a lot more research on this lacuna in the middle of Spanish art in the 12th century. Thank you.